Welcome to another episode of Omni Athlete. You believe that you can be more, and so do we. We created this show and company to do it with you by empowering your performance with the wisdom and techniques of the world's highest achieving mind, body, and spirit competitors. Okay, so today's guest is an academically trained molecular biologist and neurobiologist turned devotee, philanthropist, spiritual teacher, and award-winning documentary filmmaker. His work has inspired collaboration with the likes of Eva Longoria, Whitaker, Sana and Wyclef Jean. The stories he stewarded onto film have premiered at prestigious events like the Tribeca Film Festival and the Berlin Film Festival. His human rights and development work has taken him to over 50 plus countries, and his latest film, 3100 Run and Become, chronicles the awe-inspiring journey of participants in the world's longest certified foot race, the self-transcendence 3100-mile race, a race that requires runners to average just under 60 miles a day over the course of 52 straight days. Started by his spiritual teacher, Sri Chinmoy. It's my pleasure to introduce the Omni Athlete, Sanjay Rawal. Welcome to the show, Sanjay.
Thank you so very much, Josh. It's an honor to be on the show. And I love the introduction, but one little correction. I'm not a spiritual teacher.
Okay.
I'm an amateur and everything else that you mentioned, though, and happy to claim that status.
So this is actually a really energizing place to start. What separates you from being a spiritual teacher, or why not?
Ooh, difficult question. From an Eastern tradition, one can't be a spiritual teacher unless they get the command from deep, deep within. They say that spiritual teachers grow like mushrooms. Everybody wants to claim they're a spiritual teacher, but 99.99999% have no business doing so.
Fair enough. Well, let's say this then as we dive into this. I think there are a lot of places to start, Sanjay, but I was listening to an interview that you did with Rich Roll, actually, and a couple of the pieces in that jumped out at me was this notion of the path to bliss and the path at times, maybe the two forks that we can take to get there being suffering and joy, and how through the course of running in particular, those are two different options for us. I want to start there.
Great launching point. I think in the West, there's a notion that one can't achieve bliss except through suffering. It's deeply embedded in certain Christian mystical practices, but not all. And I think it's a misnomer that it's an actual tenet of Christian faith. In the East, we want to avoid suffering as much as possible. Suffering is not necessarily a good thing. It's something that's an aspect of human life, but in order to get to bliss, we need to move away from suffering. Suffering's not a pathway to bliss. In fact, they cancel each other out. It's like if we want to eat something sweet or taste sweet, why would we eat things that are salty? So from an Eastern standpoint, bliss and suffering are mutually exclusive. But that begets the question, how can we achieve bliss through a physical activity? The body experiences suffering on a very basic level through a very minimal amount of activity. It's like if we don't get any sleep, the body suffers. The body is really, really simple in its capacity. That said, we use our spiritual gifts and our spiritual outlook and other deeper sources of energy to transform that suffering. So it's not necessarily that the physical suffering leads to bliss. It's that by transforming and transcending physical suffering, as one feels in running sometimes when they push themselves, that's a pathway to bliss.
So the backdrop for some of this conversation, specifically around the world of sport, is running, right? It's, this film 3100 Run and Become, and this race literally requires that level of self-transcendence, and it requires tapping into that spiritual energy. And I think through the course of the film, what I saw and what I would love for you to share in the stories that you weave into it is running has such a different feel among different cultures, right? We in the West have this very particular way, I think, that we look at sport in general, but a lot around running specifically. And it doesn't have to be this necessarily grit and suffering fueled endeavor that is just about, for lack of a better word, punishment, right?
Absolutely. So like the film is about the world's longest running race, as you mentioned. It's 3,100 miles. It requires participants to do 60 miles a day, average 60 miles a day across the 52-day window. And the race takes place entirely around a half-mile loop on a sidewalk in New York City. So the first question from like a physiological point of view is recovery. There's a lot of your listeners, will have some familiarity with ultra distance running, 100-mile races that might take people anywhere from 16 or less to 24 or 36 hours. Right. And when you're looking at that short window, you can punish the body. You can just wreck it and try to reach that goal. But when you're trying to do 100 kilometers or 60 miles day in and day out, there has to be a deep sense of balance. And one has to learn how to recover at the same time as one pushes themselves. And that gets into a really Eastern, almost like metaphysical outlook, that you're familiar with through your expertise in martial arts. It's like, when you're in a fight, you can't quit. And, like Lao Tzu says, like the only way you can win a battle is by using the enemy's own strength against him or her. So when it comes to running these multi-day races, there's an idea of active recovery. And active recovery doesn't just come from eating and eating and eating. Active recovery comes from mindset. Active recovery comes from understanding that the key to recovery is eliminating stress, whether that stress is inflammation or whether that stress is in the mind. Sometimes they go together. Sometimes inflammation comes from just a hectic, harried lifestyle. And so when it comes to the 3,100-mile race, the deepest secret, which goes to the traditional aspects of running that we cover in the movie, like the Bushmen, the Navajo, the Japanese marathon monks, it's understanding that active recovery comes from pulling strength from other aspects of our being, from our heart, from our emotions, from deeper spiritual centers.
For the everyday athlete, what have you seen, whether it's been, as your own experience as an athlete and as a runner, or just what you have witnessed and seen, what allows somebody to begin tapping into those other centers of energy and gravity within the body? Because I think for so many of us, we look at the lens of recovery in a very static way. It becomes this very rest, right? Literally, don't move, eat, don't move, sleep, maybe ice bath, right? Like there isn't necessarily this connection to these other deeper centers. Where would you start someone on that journey?
So people suggest having a practice of ritual as a way to actively recover post-exercise, like meditation, like breathing. But what I learned by documenting these traditional running cultures was that they look at those activities as the ritual themselves. So rather than, I'm not saying this is bad, but like rather than amping up your MP3 player, your iPod, your iPhone, and hitting the treadmill for a couple of hours, and just zoning out, trying to eliminate the mind. Yeah. The ritualization is letting the mind understand the importance of the activity. It's unplugging. It's focusing on the breath. It's focusing on the footsteps. It's understanding that the activity itself can be a pathway to ritual or a pathway to higher worlds. So like as you saw in 3,100 Run and Become, our Navajo character, Sean Martin, an ultramarathoner, he says that running is a form of prayer. When we run, our feet are praying to Mother Earth. We're breathing in Father Sky. And that looks at running as a ritual, running as a pathway to the divine. And I think that's the next step in Western and Eastern approach to athletics. It's not just that we need ritual to recover after, but that ritualizing athletics can increase performance.
it really asks us to separate the notion. Let me not even separate, to recognize the separation we create when we're performing, right? There's this whole non-duality that occurs when we can see and pun not intended, but transcend that belief that one makes the other non-exclusive, right? And it seems like running is this beautiful vehicle for that growth and that trajectory, because it can be at times so repetitive, like this race. I mean, it's around a block, right? I mean, just the average block in the middle of New York City. I mean, it's not up and down this giant mountain, or it's not through these canyons and weaving hills. So there's this ability through an activity like running, especially in its repetitive nature, to really, I guess, transcend that duality that we often perform with.
And I think what's been key to your work and to your network's work is also looking at the aspect of competition. And that kind of like begets the question, like, how can we make competition spiritual?
Yeah.
Like, what are the benefits of competition? It's not the aggravation of coming in second. It's not trying to beat your competitor to a pulp. It's understanding that competition can bring out the best in our own individual performances, and understanding that doing better than you thought you did, is the key. It's not necessarily who's on the podium. It's like who's become a better person through it. And competition is essential to pulling out our best qualities. It's something that I'm still learning. It's like, how do you go beyond the nervous energy of competition, the aggression of competition, the decision making of competition, and enter into a flow state while you're not just getting stimulated from within. You're picking up cues from externally from the race itself.
What has that path been like for you? I know you were a competitive runner, right, through high school into college, and then kind of hit that wall that I think a lot of us as athletes go through when we don't have a connection, whether it's through competition or just through our own energetic centers, to something deeper than just run faster, win more.
So it's interesting. I'm 44, and I still think that my best times are ahead of me. That said, it's like I realize that with age, and one loses speed, one loses kind of like a certain like acumen for in performance. But that said, it's like I've finally learned how to enjoy running and to enjoy competition. When I was in my teens and in my 20s, it was all about winning. And by my late teens, I realized that like I was now running against people that I could no longer beat with the same kind of like regularity that I did like when I was in high school. Like that was easy, even in a big school in a big state. And so I burned out. And I think that's the question. It's like, do we use sports for performance, for a sense of like identification, or do we use sports to expand our identity and to become better people? That's what I finally learned, 25 years too late. But again, it's like those spiritual aspects, I think, are ageless and can propel us to doing our best regardless of our own kind of physical age.
Where did you turn when you first experienced that burnout?
That burnout led to injury. And like the injuries I had took 8 or 9 years, like joint injuries, 8 or 9 years to come back from. It was like, burnout leads to not listening to your body. It leads to like you thinking that you're failing and that you're not pushing hard enough because your body's not responding. And then you kind of will yourself to do the workout that you shouldn't be doing or push in the race where you're totally burned out, and that leads to injury. So I remember like one workout in particular. It's like one of those horror moments, that we all have in our lives. Those haunted moments where it's like I was pushing myself in a workout. I had a bad pair of shoes. but I didn't want to give up. I was so burnt out, but I didn't know I was burnt out. And at the end of that like hard 10-mile run, I ended up with a meniscus tear.
Mm.
And that wrecked me for 6 years. It took 6 years for that to heal. And that was just through mental and physical burnout and not having the spiritual wherewithal to like develop patience and understand that the goal is constantly moving.
So when you juxtapose that with a story I've heard you mention before of running, I want to say it was a 6-day race, right? Where you had a hamstring injury early on and then it healed through the course of the race. I mean, we do experience those injuries through burnout, yet so often they're manifestations of an emotional energetic imbalance, a spiritual energetic imbalance. Like they often manifest as something completely different.
So this was an interesting experience, and this is candid and embarrassing at the same time. Like it was a 6-day race, all around a 1-mile loop in Flushing Meadow Park. And as you know, it's like, and I didn't know this, but the people that give the most advice at events are the ones who have the least ability. So like I listened to somebody who looked like an ultra runner, but like the look didn't match the advice and gave me really bad advice. And it was basically like, I was running this ultra and I felt great. And, somebody yelled at me like, you're going too fast. You need to walk. And so I walked for 4 or 5 hours, never trained walking. And I yanked my hamstring. Next morning when I woke up, I wanted to quit, but there were 70, 75-year-olds in this race. And so I said, like, I might as well just stay on the course. I paid my entry fee. There's like unlimited food. And so I went from like, 8.5 to 10.5 minute miles to 35 to 40-minute miles. Like I was dragging myself around this course. And every night when I went to sleep, from days 2 through 5, it felt like my sleeping bag was full of glass. I was just destroyed. But I was praying, honestly, like literally praying and praying and praying to have the feeling of being able to run again. And that prayer built up into like desperation to the point when, like, at the end of the 5th day, the beginning of the 6th day, I felt like the hamstring finally released a little bit, and I was able to run half a mile at a time. And over the course of the last 24 hours, the half a mile at a time came, to like running a mile, mile and a half, 2 miles, and stringing out like 85 miles in my last 18 or 19 hours, which is a really good clip for a 6-day race. So in essence, that hamstring injury healed both through like active recovery and through like just pulling energy from my heart. That's all I can say. It wasn't a mystical experience that on the physical side of things, but I've never been happier in my life to run. Because like for those 4 days of being injured, all I was doing was like praying to God, praying to the divine, please let me run in this race, let me run. And when that happened, like everything unleashed and everything opened within me. And it was just like a blissful last day.
It's so powerful, Sanjay, because I think injuries for us are often, as athletes, sometimes we just don't know how to characterize them, right? And we don't know necessarily how to interpret them, or even that we can interpret them, right? There's this desire and intention to say it checks this box, so I'm going to put my recovery on this track and I'm just going to go down this path, versus saying what's happening here, and energetically, what can I be doing to better maybe realign and connect with other pieces of my being.
I agree. I mean, we all say it, but it's hard to practice that injury is an opportunity. I mean, the extreme example, like I can't remember her name, but there was a national class female marathoner who had a bad knee injury, couldn't run, and didn't really want to run in the pool, so she swam. And at the end of like the 6-month training cycle, she went out and ran a personal best, I think under 2:35. And that was saying like, I can't run, but I can use this as an opportunity, and I'll heal and maintain my fitness through an entirely different activity that doesn't seem like it'll translate to running on paper, but I'll use that willpower I accumulate. I'll use the desire that I build up to run again, to just give it my all in my target race 6 months down the line.
It's this incredible ability to transmute these different sources of energy, these different moments in life. And one of the things I've heard you speak really eloquently to, and I'd love for you to share a little bit of your perspective on this, is that so we have these different centers of energy, right, as athletes, and a lot of times it feels like in the West we don't really recognize when somebody says to lead with our heart, to pull from our heart, to really build and develop that energetic center. A lot of times we don't know what to do with that, because the notion that comes up for so many of us is softness, right? Is this ability, this is, it's weaker, it's less than, it's softer. It doesn't have the same connotation for us that it can be an energetic source of power that allows us to perform better, to take the next step, to grow physically, emotionally, all of the above.
I mean, the heart is the portal to the infinite. And that's just a fact. And I mean, the heart can contain love. You feel love in your heart, not in your mind. But at the same time, it's like infinity includes everything. Infinity includes power. Infinity includes light. Infinity includes bliss. And, when someone is happy and enthusiastic, like that's deep, deep, deep power. That's like an unrelenting force. That's an unrelenting willpower. And so it's a matter of not just introducing the idea of peace into our lives through our heart, but understanding that peace itself is power. It's like if you look at the ocean, classically represents peace, but it's like, the ocean contains like a vast amount of energy. You look at an elephant has peace. It's like, it's not affected by like little lesser wild animals. But if an elephant wants to translate that peace into strength, it can. So, I mean, these are all metaphors that might not really make any sense, but, it's a matter of really understanding the power of prayer, understanding the tools to access the power of your heart during a dynamic activity. And that comes from two things. On the most simple level, it's like you have to know where your heart is. You have to know what that feels like. You have to have a ritual around meditation, around prayer, around deep breathing. And you have to consciously try to practice accessing that quality within your training cycle. And that might come through visualization. Like, one of the examples that I like to give, and I think I told you, I did a panel for 3100 with 2016 Olympic 800 meter finalist Kate Grace. And Kate mentioned that when she runs the 800 meters, which in my opinion and in my experience is the most brutal race on a track. And it's a short race. It's like, for women, it's like, 157 to 204. You don't really have time to make a mistake. She mentioned that she begins the race imagining a tiny light or a tiny flame inside her heart. And by the end of the race, by the 600 or 700 meter mark, that flame, that light grows so big within her that it bursts into like the sun. And it's like that gives her the energy to have the ferocious kick that she has. And that visualization of the heart gives her power. It's not a mental fantasy, but she practices that. She practices that visualization when she trains. She practices that in her day-to-day life. And so like, if we're looking at developing other tools for performance, that's one of them. Understanding the heart, finding it, and finding ways to access those heartfelt experiences during training.
What other words would you use to describe that sense of love that comes from cultivating that connection with your heart?
We are scared in the West of the word God. I mean, we've in the West, people have this concept of this like really like almighty, cruel power, old man somewhere up in the heavens. But if we're really looking at ritualizing sport, it's not just pointing a finger to the heavens when you score a touchdown or something, but really understanding that, we can only do our best when we surrender our will to something higher. And when you say, like, I don't have the power to do my best, I don't have the power to reach the goals that I want to reach, but like the divine, if it infuses your heart, you can achieve miraculous results. So it's, from an Eastern standpoint, it's the idea of saying there's a universal energy out there. Mm-hmm. And if I allow that universal energy to flow through me, I'll achieve things that are astounding. And so, but that forces us to detach ourselves from our own personal ideas of a goal. Like the way a spiritual, person would look at it as saying, like, let's say your goal is like a sub 4 minute mile, and that's all you're reaching for, like 3:59.9. Whereas you don't know that divine has another plan. That divine could say, like, I want you to go under 3:54. But it's like, if you're looking at 3:59, then your splits are going to be 60 seconds, 60 seconds, 60 seconds, like 59.9. Whereas if you just let yourself go, it might be like 58, 58, 58, 58. Whereas if that happened in a race, you become scared. You go, like, I'm going too fast. So it's surrendering to an experience of transcendence in the moment, not being afraid, and saying, like, humbly, like, I don't have the power to achieve my goals.
So this is such a beautiful tension that I think shows up for a lot of, there's kind of this theme through some of our conversation so far around this notion of surrender versus pushing. And I think a lot of times, I know for me, it is constantly a learning process is what is the actualization or presence to surrender, and what is laziness, right? What is pushing too hard, and what is bringing all of my energy to bear on something, whether it's a kata that I'm training, whether it's a particular action that I'm taking. That tension of knowing what surrender, I don't know if the question here is feels like or looks like, can be really challenging to sit in.
So it's such a deep question. Like I was they called it a prayer run. I was on a prayer run with a bunch of Navajo and Hopi kids from the Southwest. And when we were on the Hopi Nation on Second Mesa, an elder named Rex came out and blessed the morning departure. And he said, find joy through exertion. I mean, it's not that exerting yourself will naturally bring you joy, but he said, like, find joy through exertion. And I realized that's the formula for self-transcendence. Joy plus exertion equals self-transcendence. So it's not just like push, 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 push. Like that'll help you achieve a result. But that result isn't going to be necessarily beyond your wildest imagination unless you can bring the idea of happiness into it. And that's the heart. Yeah. It's like in your deepest moments of pain and exertion, can you enjoy it? Like, can you find that joy? And that's when I think the potential becomes limitless. And that's like the traditional aspect of sport. Like, we have all these questions, and they're deep and they're important questions. But for the most part, people have been asking these questions for 25,000 years, right? So in the past, a lot of this wisdom wasn't written down. It was passed through silence. It was passed from master to disciple. And I think now in the 21st century, we're getting access to a lot more sources of wisdom as a race, as a human race, than we did in the past. Like, you actually had to physically be around the Buddha or around the Christ to really understand what they were teaching. But back to this Hopi elder, joy plus exertion, or find joy through exertion. And again, joy plus exertion equals self-transcendence. Like, that, I think, is the pathway. It always has been the pathway. And I think that's a secret pathway to peak performance.
This is an overly simple question, but intentionally, what gets in the way of that pathway?
I think it depends on the individual. Number one, the ego gets in the way
Hmm.
because you have your own set result. And that's what you're exerting yourself towards. And if you don't achieve that result, you're not happy. And even when you achieve that result, you see that someone else has a better result and you're not happy. So it's like you get a lot of people exert themselves to like superhuman levels. But the question is like, can you find joy in it? Now, I think for me, like one of the pinnacle examples was and is Carl Lewis. It's like in the 1984 Olympics, like when he crossed the finish line for the 100 meters, it's like his smile was beaming. And you see some performers like Mo Farah, who and Eliud Kipchoge, who run with joy when they cross the finish line, like they are beaming. When they run the race, you can see that they're really, really, really happy, and their times and their performances, are world class, if not all time, and world record setting. So, like, what stands in the way? I think at the end of the day, it's ego. Mm-hmm. It's not recognizing that when you surrender yourself, you gain power. That surrender isn't weakness. It's not an abandonment. It's like a recognition that, you can go well past your own mind's limitations or set ideas for your progress if you tap into something deeper and more real within yourself.
There's all these layers that I felt. So in watching the film, in almost every moment, it felt like there were these layers that I could feel myself either wanting to let go of personally, right? Or watching the manifestations of individuals who were letting these layers go as they ran, as they allowed their body to step into this spiritual energy and draw from it. And it was such a powerful reminder, right? Whether it was the marathon monks, whether it was Sean and the Navajo, whether it was the Bushmen or just the runners themselves, we just have so much crap stuck to us. And that as athletes, we probably don't give ourselves an opportunity as much as we could, or as coaches, the ability to say when we're practicing, when we're training, we are actively allowing those layers, those things that are stuck to us to release, to let go.
You're right. I think it's hard for us to admit as athletes, or even sometimes as coaches, that not everybody's going to be a world champion. Right. Like when we all train, even from whether we're 10 years old or 95 years old, like you're envisioning that gold medal. You're envisioning that sub 3 hour or sub 2:30 or sub 2:20 Olympic trials qualifying time. But the question is, especially as a coach, is your athlete becoming a better person? Mm. Are we using sports to become better people? And that boils down to self-transcendence. It's like the joy comes from doing better than expected, to doing better than you did yesterday, to doing better than you thought you could do within your age group. It's not a set result. It's not a podium. And it's understanding that it's like, if you do better, you're expanding your capacity. If you're expanding your capacity, you're inherently becoming a better, happier person. So understanding that happiness comes from self-transcendence. It doesn't come from a certain time or a certain place or a certain achievement. And I think that's something that anybody at any level, whether you are world class or whether you're just a hobbyist, I think that's an attitude that will inform everyone's training.
There is this energy that we can pick up on when we start to recognize just how much capacity, if we label it, the human body has within it, right? When we tap into these different energy sources, so I'd love for you, Sanjay, to share the ritual of the marathon monks and what that trek is. And then in particular, because I find when I heard this, it absolutely just shocked me in the most energizing kind of way. Some of the different rituals that they go through at the end of this trek, the fast, these different components that just really make you question what we are capable of and give you that sense of there's always more that we can tap into.
So in making 3100 Run and Become, we got rare, if not unprecedented access to not only the Navajo spiritual running culture, but to the Kalahari Bushmen in Botswana who still hunt by running, and to this kind of famed, elusive sect of monks outside Kyoto, Japan, on a mountain called Mount Hiei. Once a generation, one individual is picked to do 1,000-day trek. And if people put their math hats on for a second, it's kind of complicated. 1,000 days, not in a row. 1,000 days is split up into 10 100-day chunks. The first several 100-day cycles require the monk to do about 11 to 12 miles a day on a single track trail going up and down a mountain that's about 1,000 meters. Very muddy. They're dressed in very exotic robes with slippery bamboo sandals. By the time they get to the last couple of cycles, they're doing 56 miles a day for 100 days. They're not taking much aid at all. I mean, they're definitely not carrying gels or having camelbacks. It's an extraordinarily minimalist activity. At the same time, if they fail on any one single day to hit the allotted daily mileage, they're required to take their own lives. It sounds extreme. It sounds horrific. Very few people have actually had to take their lives, and none in the last couple of 100 years. But what that does, it sets up the monk to have the mindset of completing the 1,000 days. Like, you are prepared. And the monks say that they never think about the making that ultimate sacrifice. But it brings them into the activity with a super high level of commitment. Now, you mentioned the other kind of like alternate activities they have to undergo. At the end of the sixth cycle, after 600 days, they have to do an 8.5-day fast. Now, for those of us who live like in the US, like, it doesn't sound that hard. People have done like maple syrup diets and whatever for 8.5 days. But this is 8.5 days, no food of any sort, no sleep for 8.5 days. You're chanting with a couple of monks always by you, chanting with you to make sure that you're awake and coherent. And 8.5 days with no water. By the end of that and people say like, how is that possible? I don't know how it's possible, but they do it. I mean, we saw it. And so at the end of the 8.5 days, apparently the aspirants are so sensorily, or like their senses are so acute, that they can hear the ash fall off of incense. That activity apparently takes them to the very edge of death so they can see both worlds. And God, it's like, I'm sure on some level that makes the last 400 days seem like a breeze. But again, at the end of the 1,000th day, after a little bit of recovery, they have to do, I forget how many days. I think 6 days of sitting in front of a fire, offering literally millions of bamboo reeds upon which villagers and devotees have written prayers. And they're in front of this fire for 16 hours a day. They can eat and drink afterwards, but during those 16 hours, they can't eat and drink. And the monks actually say that 6-day ritual with the fire is actually harder than the 8.5 days of fasting, just because they say like you become so dehydrated and just wrecked sitting like basically in front of that fire for such a long period of time.
So there was this first sense for me when I heard that was shock, right? And awe, in the sense of what we perceive the human body can do and what it's demonstrated to be capable of doing there. And then what followed for me is this thought of how much do we walk around with through the ego, these different layers, these different shields, armors that we carry that prevent us from recognizing the capacity we have to just, again, transcend what we think we're capable of when somebody can do something like that. I mean, after I sat with it for a moment, Sanjay, it was energizing. Like, oh my gosh, what stops us from really seeing our full potential or capacity, at least on that trajectory of growth?
So I was extraordinarily lucky to have spent my 20s and early 30s with the Indian spiritual teacher Sri Chinmoy. And he was based in New York City and practiced meditation at the UN and was very close to the kind of classical peace leaders of his day, like Mother Teresa and Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu. Really curiously, at the age of 55, he took up weightlifting. And he said his whole life he thought that weightlifters were like mindless, literally, he said. But like from a deep, deep place within, he was commanded to take up weightlifting. And he was forced to kind of like, throw himself heart and soul into it. And through that practice, he became extraordinarily close with like Bill Pearl and Frank Zane and Mike Katz and, Wayne D'Amelia, Dan Lurie. And he says that, he says jokingly, like how his pride was shattered by, seeing how soulful weightlifting was. And people have to look it up online. I mean, I made a short film called Challenging Impossibility. If you Google that on Vimeo, you can see this 30-minute film, which was at the Tribeca Film Festival, that chronicled one night in 2004 where he did a 4.5-hour workout in front of Carl Lewis, in front of Bill Pearl, in front of Frank Zane, where he lifted over 200,000 pounds through a variety of activities. And this included, I believe, a 2,200-pound standing calf raise lift at the age of 73. An extraordinary amount of power. And he was a slight man. He did not have the strength of like the physique of a world's strongest man. But he said that inner peace is a source of outer power. And he showed it. And he said that he did it because like lifting was the most striking way that he could exhibit his philosophy of the human body having boundless inner capacity and boundless strength if we aligned the capacity of the body with the capacity of the soul. Now, I'm not saying I come any close at all to understanding that, but I saw it and I know it's possible. And I know that philosophy is real. And so the idea that Sri Chinmoy tried to promote through athletics was that we can make a tremendous amount of spiritual progress when we align our body with our soul, not our body with our ego, not our body even with like, I don't mean it in the way that your beautiful t-shirt says, but like not even our body with like our mind's like concept of success, but going to a place where we allow the deepest part of our being, our heart and our soul to infuse the body with their capacity. And when that happens, it's like you see a 73-year-old man, like you'll see in the movie, like literally lifting an elephant, lifting tens of thousands of pounds in ways that 25-year-olds couldn't even dream of. So I saw that the capacity's there. And I saw that the potential's there. And it just made the idea of performance, physical performance, like that much more interesting to me.
Do you think, so one of the really fascinating aspects of the 3100 race is the age of the participants. And I heard you reflect on this, and I'm really curious because what pinged in me, you mentioned they are mostly older participants, right? It's not 20s and 30s, or it's 40s, 50s, and 60s that are competing in this race and doing these incredible feats that for most of us that are younger go, how in the world could we do that? And there's this notion of spiritual growth and spiritual development and being able to tap into these energy sources as we grow as human beings. And what came up for me was this thought of, if we look at sport through that capacity, if we look at just athletic rigor through that capacity, does that escalate our spiritual development? Does that escalate our ability to get further attuned to that energy?
It's a very, very interesting question. I mean, you're right. Like the participants in the 3100, for the most part, are in their late 30s, early 40s. There was a 60-year-old African-American woman who completed the distance with an hour to spare in 2017. That said, it's like, I do think that there are plenty of 20-year-olds that have the capacity to do that race. It's a question of overcoming fear. Ashbihani Alto, the star of the film, a Finnish paper boy, who's done the 3,100-mile race now 14 times. I think when he first did it, he was 29 years old. Hmm. The youngest participant, youngest finisher, I think, was in their early 20s. So I think it's just a question, not just of spiritual progress, but an understanding of fear and how that shouldn't be a barrier to anything that we try to achieve. I mean, you said it. I was the same way. I still am the same way. Like you said 20-year-olds, when they hear that distance, you go like, how is that possible?
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to just a lack of imagination, that we have a lack of understanding of like the boundless capacity that we have beyond the physical. And people do gain those insights through years of performance, years of training, but every once in a while, there's a rare example of somebody young who does it.
What has your relationship with fear been like as you've progressed, both as an athlete and just as you've progressed as a human being?
You know, I hate to say it's still there. Like, I think that's one of my main limitations. It's like there's a strong sense of fear of failure. You know, so that like, you know, that is not healthy when you have to race, right? And fear of what other people think. You know, fear of people knowing what your old times were, especially as you become older, and, you know, fear of people thinking that, you know, you're not running as fast as you did. And so it speaks to the constant motivation of why we do sports. Again, like in our 20s, in my 20s, it's like you do sports to win, right? And then you think that's all there is. And when you stop winning, you go like, what reason do I have to do sports? And so I think that's the spiritual transformation. It's saying like, you know, forget about the idea of winning and losing. Like, you know, I know sports are a good thing. And how can I find a new reason and a new motivation to find that joy through exertion? And really finally understand what self-transcendence is.
Do you think that sense of burnout becomes almost a signal? If we don't, so often, and I've experienced this personally in multiple moments with the martial arts, right? Which is this incredibly beautiful practice, but at different times, I felt that sense of burnout with my own practice and competition and training and developing, and where I know in the past, I really wished I had seen the signals of burnout, not as a sense of the need to stop, pull back, pull away, but the need to really evaluate what's driving it, right? And where that why, where that center is for me. Is that what burnout can come to represent for us? Because as athletes, we often use burnout as a reason to stop, to transition away from, where it may just be a signal to recenter.
So I was never a morning runner. I hated running in the morning. I hated racing in the morning. And it was only through the production of 3,100 that, you know, I became a morning runner. Like for the Navajo, they run in the morning to the east, you know, to the sun. And running is that kind of morning ritual, morning spiritual ritual. I mean, I've meditated in the morning for, you know, 25 plus years. But it's only been in the last year that I wake up going like, I need running as a ritual. I need the ritual of that morning run. And when I look at it that way, there's no more burnout.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah, I might not want to run. I might not have the capacity or like the physical motivation to run, you know, that hard speed workout, but it's like, I'm still going to go and run, you know, because I know that it's the opposite of burnout now.
What does that word ritual mean to you, Sanjay?
You know, it's interesting because I think at the end of the day, ritual means finding meaning in the moments. You know, ritual is not necessarily just sitting through a 3-hour mass, right? Like you'd be bored out of your mind. Like the idea is like, how can you find spiritual sustenance in every single moment? And when that comes to sports, it's like, how do you look at training and performance as that type of spiritual practice? I mean, every athlete has their own quote unquote rituals, where you realize like before a performance, you have to go through a checklist, and it's really, really important. You value it. It puts you in the right mindset. So it's taking that concept of achieving that kind of like peak mindset before competition, but bringing that into each workout, saying like this workout, like if you're in a competition and you go through your rituals, you go like, I can only achieve my peak performance if I go through these rituals. But we don't necessarily have the same mindset in training, because there's not the same type of result that we're looking for from training. The result's right there in competition. You're either going to win or you're going to lose. But it's if we can put goals on our day-to-day training, like this session is going to make me a better person. Like, what do I need to do to have it make me a better person? Well, I need to mentally prepare. I need to physically prepare. I need to realize that this workout could change my life. And I need to really, really take each moment seriously. And at the end of the day, again, not just exert myself, but enjoy this. Like, how can I find joy in this really mundane, repetitive workout?
There's this phrase that comes to mind for me, and I don't know where this will take us, but this notion of the practice of being in practice.
Yeah, that's a great phrase. It's the idea of not tying yourself to an idea of success, but progress. Again, success doesn't necessarily mean self-transcendence, but progress means self-transcendence. I mean, you can have success and progress at the same time, but you can't really, you can have progress alone, and a success without progress is really no joy at all. So I think that goes into like the understanding of the idea that today's goal, as Sri Chinmoy said, today's goal is tomorrow's starting point. And it's a quote that we use in the movie. It's understanding that like every day there's a new goal, and that what you achieve today shouldn't limit you. It's like you can go beyond that tomorrow.
It's a really liberating energy, right? And maybe that's one of the reasons why this notion of sport as a spiritual practice can really help shift so much of the way we see it, because it does liberate energy that often gets trapped for us in the pursuit and limitation of a set goal, and a lot of times of a specific external result-based goal.
I totally agree. I mean, we need to have goals in our training. We need to be pushing towards certain realities. We have to work really, really, really hard. But again, it's like the payoff is not there unless we have happiness too. And so again, it's like that Hopi saying blew my mind, like find joy through exertion. It's like this is not a game for the weak, but you can't just be physically strong. You can't just exert. You have to be spiritually strong and find joy. And so how do you do that? It's through understanding the importance of the activity and making you a better person. It's understanding that sports can transform your life on a workout by workout basis. And it can be cultivating an idea of surrender, that I'm not going to surrender to my limitations. At the same time, I'm going to develop patience. And at the same time, I'm going to realize that if I can really allow myself to become an instrument of the divine, of God, and if I can use prayer, I can achieve things that I couldn't even comprehend.
Sanjay, this has been incredibly energizing. Before I ask my final question, where can these guys go to connect with you online?
Well, so the film is available now in the US and Canada on iTunes and on Amazon. You can find us and you find me at 3100 Film on Instagram. The Facebook site's a little less interesting, but you can message us at 3100 Film on Instagram. But I really encourage people to check out the movie. Of course, I was extraordinarily lucky to have you at our Boulder screening, along with Kat Bradley and Tim Olson, and we had a wonderful series thanks to you. And I'm a huge admirer of the work that you guys do, sports, consciousness, energy. It's amazing that more people aren't, aligned with those principles, but in many ways, you guys are trendsetters, and I hope that your work spreads far and wide because it's absolutely important.
Thank you, Sanjay. Wow. So this show is called Omni Athlete because we want to understand what it takes to be the ultimate body, mind, and spirit competitor. So the final question of the show is, what does it mean to you to be an Omni Athlete?
Again, this is a great question. This is like the best podcast ever. I think it's understanding that spiritual progress in the body involves demolishing lethargy. It's developing a sense of incredible enthusiasm, not just just mentally, but enthusiasm in the body to wake up early in the morning, to train, to really enjoy the exertion, to enjoy pushing oneself, and to understand all the things that one needs to do that, from nutrition to sleep to stress reduction, and realizing that if I align myself around my workouts in a spiritual and physical way, my entire life and all the things I want to achieve are going to be that much more enjoyable. Like when my body is happy, everything else is happy.
I love that. Sanjay, thank you for being on the show. Oh my gosh. Guys, if you are not familiar with the film 3100, go check it out right now. Download it, watch it multiple times. The impact of this film on what it means to be an athlete is hard to put into words, because there is so much that we experience as athletes that is spiritual. And a lot of times we aren't necessarily given the language. That's why we're here, is to really build this language and this lexicon for the spiritual energy of sport and what that feels like. And what Sanjay and his team did with this film is capture that spiritual energy and showcase not only why it matters, but what it looks and feels like and where its roots are in us as human beings, because it's such a natural force and energetic sense that we perform with, we play with, we recover with, we transition with, we train with. We just have to recognize it and allow ourselves to tap into it. And as the theme of this episode was, surrender to it. So go check out Sanjay's work on the film, and just in general, connect with Sanjay. He's an incredible individual. And until next time, thank you for watching this episode of Omni Athlete.
Thank you so very much, Josh.
Hey, what is up, guys? Thank you for watching another episode of Omni Athlete. Please go like and subscribe to our podcast. That is our goal right now, is just to build this community as big as we possibly can, and we need your help to do it. So like and subscribe, share our content, guys. If this content adds any value to your world, that helps you perform, connect, go deeper, go wider, whatever it is that it does for you, if it provides value, all we ask is that you share our content and help grow this community. We can't accomplish our goal of elevating global consciousness through sport without you. You are an integral part of this mission and this purpose, and we need your help. So please go like, subscribe, and share our content, and continue to help us build and grow this community that is truly motivated to not just elevate consciousness, but elevate and shift the very culture of sport, so that we can truly experience the athletic experience in a brand new and energizing way for so many people, guys. So thank you, and please like and subscribe. Until next time.